The moment Deputy Mike Ransom and Officer Eddie Brooks marched into my orchard, one clutching a clipboard like a shield and the other nervously fiddling with his cap, I knew something absurd was about to unfold. I stood there, wearing my trusty muddy boots next to a cherry tree older than both of them combined, and watched as they tried to tell me to vacate my own property because some woman who didn't even live within shouting distance thought the land somehow belonged to her gardening club. That I laughed out loud before they even finished the sentence. Not because it was genuinely funny, but because it was so outrageous it felt like I had been dropped into the world's worst sitcom, one written by someone who had never set foot on a farm. This orchard wasn't just dirt and trees. It had been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather, Russell Tate, planted the first sapling after returning from the war, determined to carve out a piece of heaven from rough Carolina soil. Over the decades, the orchard became a living journal of my family's history. My parents were married beneath the blooming apple trees. I learned how to climb and fall out of those trees, and it was under these very branches I decided to retire instead of selling the land to slick developers waving big checks. But just a few years back, trouble sprouted next door in the form of the newly built Silverbrook Estates, a pristine cul-de-sac with more regulations than common sense. And from that shiny subdivision emerged Candace Miller, newly minted HOA president and self-declared empress of all she surveyed. Candace was the kind of woman who believed that a clipboard and a superiority complex could bend the universe to her will. She wore designer sunglasses indoors and barked at her neighbors like she was commanding troops on a battlefield. It didn't matter that my orchard had been thriving decades before the first brick was laid in Silverbrook Estates. To her, it was unsightly wilderness in desperate need of civilizing. A few days before the officers came, Candace strutted up my gravel driveway in her stiff blazer and high heels sinking into the dirt. I was atop a ladder pruning one of the older peach trees when she hollered up at me, waving a folder stuffed with papers. With the air of someone handing down a royal decree, she announced that the HOA had rezoned the area and that my orchard was now community property. I nearly tumbled off the ladder laughing. Once I wiped the tears from my eyes, I climbed down, wiped my hands on my jeans, and carefully explained that private property, registered decades before her HOA was even a thought, couldn't be rezoned by a homeowners association. The deed, filed in 1951, was as ironclad as it got. Candace didn't appreciate that answer. She narrowed her eyes, muttered something about involving authorities, and stomped away, leaving tiny stiletto craters in my driveway. Honestly, I figured that was the end of it. Most HOA types like to bark louder than they bite. Then the police showed up. Officer Ransom and Officer Brooks shuffled around awkwardly, mumbling about responding to a community complaint. Across the street, Candace perched in her golf cart like Napoleon surveying a battlefield, sunglasses gleaming with the promise of petty vengeance. That I asked the officers if they had a warrant. They did not. I asked if they had even a basic understanding of property law. They did not. I offered to show them the original deed. They nodded so fast it looked like bobbleheads. It took me about 3 minutes to pull the file out from my kitchen cabinet. When they read it, their shoulders slumped visibly. They apologized profusely, saying they had to follow up when complaints were filed, but clearly there was no crime here. As they trudged back to their cruiser, I gave Candace a big, exaggerated wave. Her face turned a furious shade of purple before she peeled away in her golf cart. I should have known that wasn't the end of it. Candace was not the type to accept being wrong. No, people like her don't back down. They build fortresses atop their mistakes. Within days, laminated community garden rules signs sprouted along my fence line. Colorful flyers promising free fruit picking days appeared stapled to utility poles. I even spotted kids traipsing through the orchard pulling apples off branches like it was an amusement park. That was the last straw that I drove straight into town and bought a dozen big, bold private property, no trespassing signs. I installed them at every possible entrance, backed up by security cameras hidden discreetly among the branches. I also gave my cousin Ray, a deputy sheriff, a heads up about the situation. He promised to swing by on patrols. Just a little extra insurance. The next morning, I found Candace perched at a folding table at the entrance to the orchard, handing out pamphlets titled The Future of Silverbrook's Community Orchard. I blinked at her audacity. She acted like she was hosting a bake sale, not committing open trespass. I confronted her calmly. I pointed to the giant private property sign behind her. I pointed to my deed. She looked right through all of it and chirped. The community has spoken. I realized, standing there staring at her, that reason would not win this war. She wasn't operating in reality. She had built a fantasy kingdom where clipboards outranked law books. That evening, a thick envelope appeared under my door. Inside, a formal letter dripping with bureaucratic nonsense, accusing me of illegally appropriating community land and ordering me to cease all activity in the orchard immediately. I laughed so hard my coffee nearly came out my nose. Then I called my lawyer, Marshall Dean. Marshall read the letter twice, muttered, "These people are out of their damn minds," and started drafting a response that would make their heads spin. He also told me to keep meticulous records. People like Candace thrive on technicalities. A few days later, Candace returned, this time accompanied by two flunkies armed with a measuring wheel, the kind surveyors use, and clipboards. They started measuring and planting little flags deep into my property, declaring parts of it community commons. I didn't interfere. I simply filmed the entire spectacle from my porch, capturing every absurd flag placement and fake measurement. The next day, a crude map was taped to my gate, scribbled with colored pencil, divvying up my orchard into picnic areas and walking trails. I tore it down, took photos for evidence, and prepared my next move. With Marshall's help, I filed to have my orchard officially protected under the state's Agricultural Heritage Act. That status fortified my legal rights and turned any unauthorized activity into a potential felony. Candace had no idea the fortress I was quietly building around my land. In the meantime, I installed more cameras, updated security alerts to my phone, and doubled the locks. Candace, growing more desperate, sent in a fake city inspector, a man with no credentials and a laminated badge that looked like it came from a Halloween store. I sent him packing and called the real authorities. Ray and his fellow deputies were more than happy to help. We compiled evidence, witness statements, security footage, and prepared to take the fight to the next level if needed. Candace wasn't done. She organized an illegal community harvest day, leading a parade of Silverbrook residents, armed with baskets and step stools, down my driveway. I blocked the path, cameras rolling. I warned them that trespassing charges were imminent. Most folks backed off. Candace screeched away in her golf cart again, hurling accusations over her shoulder. Then came the online attacks. Candace blasted me on Silverbrook's HOA page, accusing me of hoarding community resources, endangering children, and being a selfish land hog. But this time, the tide turned. Dozens of residents called her out publicly, questioning why HOA dues were being used to fund her nonsense. Emboldened by public support, I moved to the next phase. Filing for a restraining order, Candace's final act of desperation was almost laughable. One dawn, I caught her sneaking onto my property with two teenagers, stringing up a huge tarp that declared the orchard a Silverbrook HOA park. I stormed over, headlights blazing, and shut it down immediately. That was the final straw. Marshall filed an emergency restraining order, and days later at the HOA board meeting, Candace's empire crumbled spectacularly. Before a packed clubhouse, Marshall laid out the original deed, historical records, video evidence of trespassing, and documentation of Candace's lies. The room was silent as a tomb when Deputy Ray walked in and served Candace the restraining order in front of everyone. Candace fled, her reputation shattered. Within weeks, the county audit exposed even more: fraudulent use of HOA funds, falsified documents, unauthorized events. She was banned from serving on any board and faced heavy fines, and potentially even criminal charges. Meanwhile, the orchard stood tall and serene. I hosted a harvest festival that fall. Families picnicked under the apple trees. Children chased each other between the rows, and music floated through the warm, golden air. The orchard had survived, thrived. It stood as a testament not only to generations past, but to the stubborn endurance of those who refused to be bullied. And me? I sat under the old cherry tree, sweet tea in hand, smiling up at the stars, and knew with quiet certainty this land was ours, Daiti always would be, and no one would ever take it from us.